And I know you guys brought your popcorn and are looking forward to the video from Dr. Weaver. Amanda's over here all wrapped up. She said she should have brought her popcorn. But anyway, what was that?
So text Tyler, get him to bring some.
Yeah. Tyler can bring popcorn as well as pretzels.
Yeah, but as much noise as he can make with one bag of pretzels, I don't know whether we could hear anything if he did the popcorn. It's kind of amusing to me how he can make that much noise with one bag. But anyway, I will attempt to start this, and Tom, if it doesn't come through, let me know, okay?
Okay. Okay, now we got the computer.
All right.
Well, we'll have it back when it starts playing.
Welcome to Harmful Effects in Emergency Response, developed by Dr. Mike Weaver, Professor and Director at Virginia Tech Pesticide Programs. This lesson is adapted from Applying Pesticides Correctly, Unit 7. Now here's Mike to discuss harmful effects in emergency response.
Most pesticides are designed to harm or kill pests. Because some pests have systems similar to the human system, some pesticides also can harm or kill humans. Fortunately, humans usually can avoid harmful effects by avoiding being exposed to pesticides. Humans may be harmed by pesticides in two ways. They may be poisoned or injured. Pesticide poisoning is caused by pesticides that harm internal organs or other systems inside the body. Pesticide-related injuries usually are caused by pesticides that are external irritants. Pesticides that are chemically similar to one another cause the same type of harmful effects to humans. These effects may be mild or severe depending on the pesticide involved and the amount of overexposure. But the pattern of illness and injury
we just lost the video.
Some pesticide chemical families can cause both external irritation injuries and internal poisoning illnesses. Some pesticides are highly toxic to humans. Only a few drops in the mouth or on the skin can cause extremely harmful effects. Other pesticides are less toxic, but too much exposure to them will also cause harmful effects. Hazard is the risk of harmful effects from pesticides. Hazard depends on both the toxicity of the pesticide and the exposure you'll receive in any given situation. Pesticide exposure is when a pesticide comes into contact with a surface or an organism. Toxicity is a measure of the ability of a pesticide to cause harmful effects. For humans, a pesticide exposure means getting pesticides in or around the body. The toxic effect of a pesticide exposure depends on how much pesticide is involved and how long it remains there.
Well, they lost.
Pesticides contact your body in four main ways. Oral exposure, when you swallow a pesticide. Inhalation exposure, when you inhale a pesticide. Ocular exposure, when you get a pesticide into your eyes. Or dermal exposure, when you get a pesticide on your skin. Avoiding and reducing exposure to pesticides will reduce the harmful effects of pesticides. You can avoid or reduce exposures by using engineering controls or safety systems such as closed systems and enclosed cabs. And you can reduce exposures by wearing appropriate personal protective equipment, washing exposed areas often, and keeping your personal protective equipment clean and in good operating condition. In most pesticide handling situations, the skin is the part of the body that is most likely to receive exposure. Evidence indicates that about 97% of all body exposure that happens during pesticide spraying is by contact with the skin. The only time that inhalation is a greater hazard than skin contact is when you are working in a poorly ventilated enclosed space and are using a fumigant or other pesticide that is highly toxic by the inhalation route. The amount of pesticide that is absorbed through the skin and eyes into your body depends on the pesticide itself and the material used to dilute the pesticide, the area of the body that's exposed, and the condition of the skin exposed. Here you see a diagram of the different areas of the body and the absorption rate, which varies from one area of the body to the other. If your forearm is a factor of 1, you can compare some of the other areas of the body as to how fast chemicals absorb through the skin. One of the best ways to avoid pesticide exposure is to avoid situations and practices where exposures commonly occur. Oral exposures often are caused by not washing hands before eating, drinking, smoking, or chewing, mistaking the pesticide for food or drink, accidentally applying pesticides to food, or splashing pesticide into the mouth through carelessness or accidents. Inhalation exposures are often caused by prolonged contact with pesticides in closed or poorly ventilated spaces. breathing vapors from fumigants and other toxic pesticides, breathing vapors, dust, or mist while handling pesticides without appropriate protective equipment, inhaling vapors present immediately after a pesticide is applied, for example from drift or from re-entering an area too soon, and using a respirator that fits poorly, or using an old or inadequate filter, cartridge, or canister. Dermal exposure is often caused by not washing the hands.
All right, I'm going to have to back up because I just now got it going for them.
Splashing or spraying pesticides on unprotected skin or eyes, wearing pesticides.
We don't have it again. We lost it about a second after it came up. So we don't have it.
Pesticides that are chemically similar to one another cause the same type of harmful effects to humans. These effects may be mild or severe depending on the pesticide involved and the amount of overexposure. But the pattern of illness or injury caused by each chemical group is usually the same. Some pesticide chemical families can cause both external irritation injuries and internal poisoning illnesses. Some pesticides are highly toxic to humans. Only a few drops in the mouth or on the skin can cause extremely harmful effects. Other pesticides are less toxic, but too much exposure to them will also cause harmful effects. Hazard is the risk of harmful effects from pesticides. Hazard depends on both the toxicity of the pesticide and the exposure you will receive in any given situation. Pesticide exposure is when a pesticide comes into contact with a surface or an organism. Toxicity is a measure of the ability of a pesticide to cause harmful effects. For humans, a pesticide exposure means getting pesticides in or on the body. The toxic effect of a pesticide exposure depends on how much pesticide is involved and how long it remains there. Pesticides contact your body in four main ways: oral exposure, when you swallow a pesticide; inhalation exposure, when you inhale a pesticide; ocular exposure, when you get a pesticide into your eyes; or dermal exposure, when you get a pesticide on your skin. In most pesticide handling situations, the skin is the part of the body that is most likely to receive exposure. Evidence indicates that about 97% of all body exposure that happens during pesticide spraying is by contact with the skin. The only time that inhalation is a greater hazard than skin
still having
contact
trouble.
is when you're working.
Tom, you back?
Yep.
So you lost it?
Yeah, a couple times it came up for like 1 second when you hit it, but then it went away.
All right, let's see if I can get it. Start over here.
Okay.
I'm dealing with a combination of 16 buttons, and it doesn't seem like it ever works the same way every time. So I gotta reconfigure here. But let me start and see what I can do, and I'll try to retool the thing. All right.
Okay.
If it doesn't work, just buzz back at me, okay?
Okay. What, is it too loud for you? Oh.
All right, let me do it another way.
Yes. Okay, we got it now. Well, yeah. Say something so the camera will switch back to you.
Me? Is that what you're saying? Hang on. All right,
Okay,
I want to get it.
We don't have it again.
All right, hang on a minute. I'm trying to look and. Let me.
Hazard is the risk of harmful effects from pesticides. Hazard depends on both the toxicity of the pesticide and the exposure you will receive in any given situation. Pesticide exposure is when a pesticide comes into contact with a surface or an organism. Toxicity is a measure of the ability of a pesticide to cause harmful effects. For humans, a pesticide exposure means getting pesticides in or on the body. The toxic effect of a pesticide exposure depends on how much pesticide is involved and how long it remains there. Pesticides contact your body in four main ways: oral exposure, when you swallow a pesticide; inhalation exposure when you inhale a pesticide, ocular exposure when you get a pesticide into your eyes, or dermal exposure when you get a pesticide on your skin. Avoiding and reducing exposure to pesticides will reduce the harmful effects from pesticides. You can avoid or reduce exposures by using engineering controls or safety systems such as closed systems and enclosed cabs. And you can reduce exposures by wearing appropriate personal protective equipment, washing exposed areas often, and keeping your personal protective equipment clean and in good operating condition. In most pesticide handling situations, the skin is the part of the body that is most likely to receive exposure. Evidence indicates that about 97% of all body exposure that happens during pesticide spraying is by contact with the skin. The only time that inhalation is a greater hazard than skin contact is when you are working in a poorly ventilated and enclosed space and are using a fumigant or other pesticide that is highly toxic by the inhalation route. The amount of pesticide that is absorbed through the skin and eyes into your body depends on the pesticide itself and the material used to dilute the pesticide, the area of the body exposed, and the condition of the skin exposed. Here you see a diagram of the different areas of the body and the absorption rate, which varies from one area of the body to the other. If your forearm is a factor of 1, you can compare some of the other areas of the body as to how fast chemicals absorb through the skin. One of the best ways to avoid pesticide exposure is to avoid situations and practices where exposures commonly occur. Oral exposures often are caused by not washing hands before eating, drinking, smoking, or chewing, mistaking the pesticide for food or drink, accidentally applying pesticides to food, or splashing pesticide into the mouth through carelessness or accidents. Inhalation exposures are often caused by prolonged contact with pesticides in closed or poorly ventilated spaces, breathing vapors from fumigants and other toxic pesticides, breathing vapors, dust, or mist while handling pesticides without appropriate protective equipment, inhaling vapors present immediately after a pesticide is applied, for example from drift or from re-entering an area too soon, and using a respirator that fits poorly, or using an old or inadequate filter, cartridge, or canister. Dermal exposure is often caused by not washing the hands after handling pesticides or their containers, splashing or spraying pesticides on unprotected skin or eyes, wearing pesticide-contaminated clothing, including boots and gloves, applying pesticides or working in an area where there are windy conditions while pesticides are being applied, wearing inadequate personal protective equipment while handling pesticides, and touching pesticide-treated surfaces. Ocular exposure, or exposure to the eye, is often caused by splashing or spraying pesticides into the eyes, applying pesticides in windy weather without eye protection, rubbing your eyes or forehead with contaminated gloves or hands, or pouring dust, granules, or powdery formulations without eye protection. You mentioned that toxicity is the measure of the ability of a pesticide to cause harmful effects. Toxicity depends on the type and amount of active ingredient, the type and amount of carrier solvent ingredients, the type and amount of inert ingredients, and the type of formulation, such as a dust, a granule, powder, or emulsifiable concentrate. You can manage toxicity risks by reducing the amount of pesticide used, choosing less toxic pesticides, using alternative non-chemical controls, and implementing integrated pest management practices. In dealing with toxicity, we often use different units of measurement to describe the ability of a particular toxin to poison an organism, for example. We might use the terminology parts per million or parts per billion, parts per trillion. We might use also the description of milligrams of toxin to kilograms of body weight to compare the particular toxicity of one chemical to another, or how much it might take to poison a particular organism. And that's often lost in our ability to try to compare these numbers with just numbers in general, things that we might be able to equate to what a part per million might be. This information somewhat is used to try to help one bring that into perspective in terms of units of measurement. Here we see some of those units of measurement put to work. Where you're looking at acute toxicity measurements, both acute oral and or acute dermal for various insecticides. We use the term LD50 to describe some of these measurements. And LD50 is lethal dosage in milligrams of toxin to kilograms of body weight to kill 50% of the test population. That's where that terminology comes from. And the lethal dose here is indicated in parts per million. You'll see various insecticides listed there. And as the numbers rise, the important thing is that as those numbers rise, those particular materials are less toxic. So the higher the number, the less toxic compared to numbers of low LD50. So if you look at parathion, which is an LD50 of 3, dieldrin happens to be 33 times less toxic than the parathion, which is an LD50 of 100. And if you continue up the scale, you'll see similar comparisons there. So the higher the number, the less toxic. LD50 is described as milligrams per kilogram, or described as parts per million. And again, these are some of those units of measurement that we described earlier. You might also see the terminology LC50, and we use that when we talk about acute inhalation hazards. That's used in terms of the lethal concentration of a particular chemical. And so because you're talking about a gas or a liquid, you're talking about volume. How much in cubic centimeters does it take to kill or injure a particular organism? And so we use the term LC50 in this respect. Now that you've learned about units of measurement, let's look at some of those units of measurement and use them to compare the toxicity of one pesticide to another. Here you see a list of commonly known insecticides, and you can see there's a range in toxicity from some highly toxic materials to some relatively lower toxicity materials amongst this group of insecticides. And you can also see that there's a range from one type of product to another. That range is affected by the way that the product is formulated and just what and how much active ingredient might be in the product, for example. Here we use those units of measurement to compare different botanically derived insecticides with one another. The lesson to be taken home here is that even though a particular group might be known to be lesser toxic in nature, there still can be a fairly wide range of toxicity from one member of the group to another. And the only way to be sure of that would be to know their exact toxicity in terms of units of measurement. Here we use those units of measurement to compare not only a list of commonly known herbicides, but also some consumer product ingredients with each other. For example, aspirin, you can compare that and caffeine with some of the herbicides or with each other. You can compare table salt with some of the other sources here as far as in terms of herbicides, or you can refer back to the list we showed earlier to compare those figures. But it just gives you an indication that even some common sources of chemicals that we assume are in our everyday activities that we ingest vary in toxicity back and forth from one type or another, and do have a quality of toxicity. Can be harmful in various amounts and can have a risk and hazard to them. We wouldn't want to leave this subject without talking about synergism. Synergism is an increased activity or toxicity resulting from the effect of one chemical on another. And here you can see the LD50s, or the unit of measurement to describe toxicity for one chemical in and of itself, and then two chemicals put together. Here we're using DDT and a particular synergist together. And so you should be aware that some of these chemicals can affect each other when they're mixed together or used together in some way, and not just look at the LD50 of one chemical or another alone. Now, to the average applicator, LD50s mean very little. You can find that information out there on the material safety data sheet. You might find it in various other sources, but generally it all refers back to the label when you're using pesticides. And yet there are hints to the toxicity of a particular pesticide. A product's toxicity can be determined by looking at the product and determining how concentrated it is, whether it might have a restricted use or general use designation. If you look at the personal protective equipment requirements on the label, it might indicate that you've got to use a lot of PPE, and if you do, that's a hint that the particular material could be more toxic. The re-entry interval could be a hint of that. And there may be other label precautions and instructions that would tell you that. And then finally, the label signal word would certainly indicate whether a particular material is more toxic than another material. And then we mentioned the material safety data sheet, which would have not only the signal word information, but the National Fire Protection Association information there that would indicate what the hazards might be of a particular product being high or low toxicity. Now, in terms of the pesticide label and the signal word system that is used exclusively on pesticide labels, this is the primary warning that applicators have in determining how toxic a particular product might be. It relates back to the LD50 and the milligrams per kilogram descriptor, the units of measurement that we mentioned. But on the label, the applicator sees signal word that might indicate that it's caution, or might indicate warning or danger, poison. And that's the first line of defense as far as determining what the hazard might be as far as acute toxicity. And that means that basically the effect, the cause and effect of either coming into contact in one form or another of that particular material. So if it has a caution label, then it's generally a lower toxicity material. If it has a warning label, it's a moderately toxic material, and has a danger or danger poison label, especially with skull and crossbones, then we describe these as category 1 materials. They're highly toxic. It may only take just a very small amount of that material to injure you, to make you very ill, or to kill you. Toxicity of a particular pesticide is measured by subjecting laboratory animals, usually rats, mice, rabbits, and dogs, or tissue cultures, to different dosages of active ingredient in a formulated product over various time periods. These toxicity studies help to estimate the risk that the pesticide may cause harmful effects in humans. However, some people react more severely or more mildly than estimated. Be alert to your body's reaction to pesticides you're handling. Some people seem to be especially sensitive to individual pesticides or to groups of similar pesticides. And you do have a choice in what pesticides you use for a particular pest problem. And one of the factors you should consider is how toxic each possible choice is to persons who will use or who are exposed to the pesticides. The toxic effects vary depending on several factors, including your body chemistry, your physiology, your gender, your rate of absorption, your body weight, your state of health, the route of exposure, and the length of exposure. Now I want to talk about some of the harmful effects that can occur if you're exposed to a pesticide. Pesticides can cause 3 types of harmful effects: acute effects, delayed effects, and allergic effects. Acute effects are illnesses or injuries that may appear immediately after exposure to a pesticide, usually within 24 hours. Studying a pesticide's relative capability of causing acute effects has been the main way to assess and compare how toxic pesticides are. Acute effects can be measured more accurately than delayed effects, and they are more easily diagnosed than effects that do not appear until long after exposure. Acute effects usually are obvious and often are reversible if appropriate medical care is given promptly. Pesticides cause 4 types of acute effects. These include acute oral effects, acute inhalation effects, acute dermal effects, and acute eye effects. This graphic depicts the acute toxicity from short-term exposure. And you can see it comparing the amount of toxin in your blood, the concentration of it, versus the amount of time in which you're exposed to the material. And as you're exposed longer and the amount of toxin reaches a certain threshold concentration, you become symptomatic. And then you can get a period, of course, in which it then declines. This describes basically what the pesticide label tries to point out to you in terms of your hazard to that particular product. It describes that potential for short-term exposure. So if you have a product that's low toxicity or moderately toxic or highly toxic, it depends on the concentration of the material and how long you're exposed to it as to where you might fall in this chart when symptoms might occur. So acute toxicity and short-term exposure. Delayed effects are illnesses or injuries that do not appear immediately within 24 hours after exposure to a pesticide or combination of pesticides. Often the term chronic effects is used to describe delayed effects, but this term is applicable only to certain types of delayed effects. Delayed effects may be caused by repeated exposures to a pesticide or a pesticide group or a combination of pesticides over a long period of time, or a single exposure to a pesticide or combination of pesticides that causes a harmful reaction that does not become apparent until much later. Some pesticides cause delayed effects only with repeat exposure over a period of days, months, or even years. For example, if a rat eats a large amount of a particular pesticide at one time, the pesticide passes through the rat's system quickly and is eliminated without harmful effects. However, if the rat regularly eats small amounts of that particular material, it soon becomes ill and dies. Sometimes repeated exposures to a pesticide or family of pesticides will result in a delayed effect, but a larger exposure will cause an acute effect. Organophosphate carbamate pesticides inhibit a chemical called cholinesterase in the nervous system of humans. A large exposure causes immediate acute illnesses. Smaller exposures cause no apparent problem at first. They inhibit the cholinesterase, but not enough to cause immediate illness. Small repeated exposures to these pesticides over several days or weeks may greatly reduce your cholinesterase levels in your body. At that point, even a small exposure to a pesticide with relatively low cholinesterase inhibiting properties may trigger severe illness. So a person has to be particularly careful about how they use the materials, and what materials they do use. Here we see an example of chronic toxicity from repeat exposures. And you can see the time versus the concentration of the material in the blood. And again, we see that threshold concentration and when and how the particular organism, in this case a human, becomes symptomatic. So you can have repeated exposures over time, over weeks and months and years, and then suddenly you have some type of symptom. It may not be the same type of symptom you would equate with an acute exposure, but you have some type of reaction to the material. Now let's talk a little bit about the different types of delayed effects. And these include chronic effects, developmental and reproductive effects, and systemic effects. Chronic effects are illnesses or injuries that appear a long time, usually several years after exposure to a pesticide. Some delayed effects that are suspected to result from a pesticide's chronic toxicity include production of tumors or oncogenic effects, production of malignancy or cancer effects or carcinogenic effects, changes in the genes or chromosomes, or mutagenic effects. And this can even be hinted on some pesticide labels. We're seeing more warnings on labels to this effect. The example used here would be the product has been determined to cause tumors in laboratory animals. Developmental effect is an injury or illness that occurs to a fetus in the womb of a woman who has been exposed to a pesticide. These effects include birth defects or teratogenic effects, and illness or death, miscarriage or stillbirth, to a fetus, or fetotoxic effect. A reproductive effect is an injury to the reproductive system of exposed men or women. These effects include infertility or sterility in men or women and impotence in men. Some developmental or reproductive effects are thought to occur immediately after exposure to a pesticide or combination of pesticides, but they may not be apparent for some time after the exposure. For example, a birth defect may be seen only after the birth of a child, which may be several months after the exposure. Other developmental or reproductive effects are thought to result from repeated exposures to a pesticide or combination of pesticides over a period of time. A delayed systemic effect is an illness or injury to a system in the body that does not appear immediately within 24 hours after exposure to a pesticide or combination of pesticides. Such effects include blood disorders or hemotoxic effects, such as anemia or inability to coagulate, nerve or brain disorders, neurotoxic effects, such as paralysis, nervous excitation, behavioral changes, tremor, blindness, and brain damage, skin disorders such as rash, irritation, discoloration, and ulceration, lung and respiratory disorders such as emphysema and asthma, liver and kidney disorders such as jaundice and kidney failure. Scientists, pesticide manufacturers, and the Environmental Protection Agency cannot yet be sure what the delayed effects of too much exposure to individual pesticides or combinations of pesticides may be. It may be years before there are clear answers on the effects of all pesticides and combinations of pesticides in use today. When there is clear evidence that a pesticide may cause harmful effects to humans, the EPA may remove the pesticide from use, require label warning statements, require specific personal protective equipment or safety systems, require changes in dosages, methods or frequency of application, and waiting times before entry, harvest, slaughter, or grazing, and restrict the use to certain pesticide applicators. Avoid delayed effects by limiting your exposure to pesticides. Allergic effects are harmful effects that some people develop in reaction to substances that do not cause the same reaction in most other people. Allergic reactions are not thought to occur during a person's first exposure to a substance. The first exposure causes the body to develop repelling response chemicals to that substance. A later, second, third, or more exposure results in the allergic response. This process is called sensitization, and substances that cause people to become allergic to them are known as sensitizers. Certain substances cause many people to develop an allergic reaction. Poison ivy, for example, causes a severe skin rash in many people. Other substances cause allergic reactions in only a few people. Turfgrass, for example, causes a severe skin rash in relatively few people. Some people are sensitized to certain pesticides. After being exposed once or a few times without effect, they develop a severe allergy-like response upon later exposure. These allergic effects include systemic effects such as asthma or even life-threatening shock, skin irritation such as rash, blisters, or open sores, and eye and nose irritation such as itchy, watery eyes and sneezing. Unfortunately, there's no way to tell which people may develop allergies to which pesticides. However, certain people seem to be more chemically sensitive than others. They develop an allergic response to many types of chemicals in their environment. These persons may be more likely to develop allergies to pesticides. A Depending on how severe the allergic reaction is, persons with allergies to certain pesticides may have to stop handling or working around those pesticides. They may be unable to tolerate even slight exposures. Sometimes persons with allergies to certain pesticides can continue to work in situations where those pesticides are present by reducing their exposure to them. Watch for two kinds of clues to pesticide-related illness or injury. Some clues are feelings that only the person who has been poisoned can notice, such as nausea or headache. These are symptoms. Other clues, like vomiting or fainting, can be noticed by someone else. These are signs. You should know what your own symptoms might be and what signs of poisoning to look for in your coworkers and others who may have been exposed. Many of the signs and symptoms of pesticide poisoning are similar to signs and symptoms of other illnesses you might experience, such as the flu or a hangover. If you've been working with pesticides and then develop suspicious signs and symptoms, call your physician or poison control center. Only a physician can diagnose pesticide poisoning injuries. Some of the harmful effects of external irritants include redness, blisters, rash, and burns to the skin, swelling, a stinging sensation, or burns in the eyes, nose, mouth, and throat. Pesticide poisoning may cause nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, or stomach cramps, headache, dizziness, weakness, or confusion, excessive sweating, chills, or thirst, chest pains, difficult breathing, cramps in your muscles, or aches all over your body. Poisoning by some pesticide chemical families results in distinctive signs that help others to recognize the cause of the poisoning. Organophosphate and methylcarbamate poisoning, for example, is often identified by the presence of very small pinpoint pupils in the victim's eyes. Poisoning by pesticides containing arsenic or phosphorus is often identified by a garlic odor on the victim's breath. Ask your physician or poison control center to obtain the latest edition of Recognition and Management of Pesticide Poisonings by Donald Morgan. This book is available through the EPA, the Government Printing Office, and is also available online on the internet. Many physicians have not been trained to recognize and treat pesticide poisonings or injury and may rarely see such cases. You too should know the harmful effects of the pesticides you use. The core manual has an appendix with this information available to the applicator. What should you do in responding to a pesticide poisoning emergency? Get medical advice quickly if you or any of your fellow workers have unusual or unexplained symptoms starting at work or later the same day. Do not let yourself or anyone else get dangerously sick before calling your physician or going to the hospital. It's better to be too cautious than too late. Take the pesticide container or the labeling to the physician. Do not carry the pesticide container in the passenger space of a car or truck, and do not allow you or the container or other contaminated materials that might go along with you to contaminate the emergency room or contaminate or contact emergency personnel. What about applying first aid for pesticide poisoning? Well, the best first aid in pesticide emergencies is to stop the source of the pesticide exposure as quickly as possible. First aid is the initial effort to help a victim while medical help is on the way. If you're alone with the victim, make sure the victim is breathing and is not being further exposed to the pesticide before you call for emergency help. Apply artificial respiration if the victim is not breathing. Do not become exposed to the pesticide yourself while you are trying to help. In an emergency, look at the pesticide labeling if possible. If it gives specific first aid instructions, follow those instructions carefully. If labeling instructions are not available, follow the general guidelines for first aid. Heat stress is the illness that occurs when your body is subjected to more heat than it can cope with. Heat stress is not caused by exposure to pesticides, but may affect pesticide handlers who are working in hot conditions. Personal protective equipment worn during pesticide handling activities can increase the risk of heat stress by limiting your body's ability to cool down. If you're under a physician's care, you should consult your physician before working in hot conditions. Mild forms of heat stress will make you feel ill and impair your ability to do a good job. You may get tired sooner, feel weak, be less alert, and be less able to use good judgment. Severe heat stress is a serious illness. Unless victims are cooled down quickly, they can die. Severe heat stress is fatal to more than 10% of its victims, even young, healthy adults. Many who survive suffer permanent damage. Sometimes the victims remain highly sensitive to heat for months and are unable to return to the same work. Learn the signs and symptoms of heat stress and take immediate action to cool down if you suspect you may be suffering from even mild heat stress. Signs and symptoms may include fatigue, including exhaustion, muscle weakness, headache, nausea, and chills, dizziness and fainting, severe thirst and dry mouth, clammy skin or hot, dry skin, heavy sweating or complete lack of sweating, altered behaviors such as confusion, slurred speech, quarrelsome, or irrational attitude. What about first aid for heat stress? It's not always easy to tell the difference between heat stress illness and pesticide poisoning. The signs and symptoms are similar. Don't waste time trying to decide what is causing the illness. Get medical help. First aid measures for heat stress victims are similar to those for persons who are overexposed to pesticides. Keep the victim into a shaded or cool area. Cool the victim as rapidly as possible by sponging or splashing the skin, especially the face, the neck, the hands, the forearms, with cool water, or when possible, immersing in cool water. Carefully remove all personal protective equipment and any other clothing that may be making the victim too warm. Have the victim, if conscious, drink as much cool water as possible, and keep the victim quiet until help arrives. Remember, severe heat stress or heat stroke is a medical emergency. Brain damage and death may result if treatment is delayed. Heat cramps can be quite painful. These muscle spasms in the legs, arms, and stomach are caused by loss of body salt through heavy sweating. To relieve cramps, have the victim drink lightly salted or sports drinks. Stretching or kneading the muscles may temporarily relieve the cramps. However, if you suspect that stomach cramps are being caused by pesticides rather than heavy sweating, get medical help immediately.
And that's the end of our lesson on harmful effects and emergency response. Thanks for listening.
This is all just continuation of common sense.
Yep, continuation of contents. Tom, are we back?
Yes, we are. And we were
Okay.
just talking about how heat stroke is not any fun.
No, it's not. And I got a question for you. After we watched that, how many of you would ever consider applying a pesticide?
I always still do.
Yeah.
For work.
Just with,
I would.
Well, that presentation is sort of intended to terrify you, to be honest. You know, it talks about the hazards and the problems that potentially will exist from.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's hazards in everything, even fixing a lawnmower.
Yeah. With hazard walking up steps to get into this classroom.
You could have slipped and broke your neck eventually down the stairs.
What?
I'm bad with stairs.
You're bad with stairs? I need to give you some training and get you certified in stairs. Okay.
I got no spring.
Now, realistically, this is
12 hours.
sort of a scare tactic the way he does it, and I kind of apologize for that. But he's bringing about the points that we need to be aware of.
This is what can happen if you mess up.
Yeah, it is, and you know, for you to be certified and have a private pesticide applicator's license,
You have to realize, look at
you need to be aware of what kind of issues can exist. It's safer than riding a horse, though, Glacier.
the thing that kind of got to me when we were watching that was when it was showing the black lights of the exposure.
Uh-huh.
Why in the world would anyone ever not be wearing proper face protection in order to get that stuff on their face?
Tyler, you may not be aware that you're getting it on your face. Okay,
Absolutely.
you know it's and a black light is, you know, sort of magnifies it, but yeah, it is apparent, and that was part of what we were talking about with that as to how that dust does come about. You know, it's a problem. You know, it can, and it a lot of these wettable powder materials are finely ground and they're extremely dusty, and
That
so
dust can pop up beneath the mask.
well, it can do that, and it'll actually permeate a lot of the air around you. So you know, you may be seeing it on your skin from that black light, but you also got it in your hair, down your neck, and down your collar. You know, so that's one of the reasons that the chemical industry has, over the last several years, moved away from that type of formulation.
To reduce indirect exposure like that.
Right. They reduce the dust and so forth that are associated with it. They've gone to more of a granulated type of formulation instead of that wettable powder type.
Instead of having the powdery little chunks.
And
Oh,
going to encapsulate. Yeah, Tom?
well, I was going to give Tyler another reason why sometimes people might be applying it without using masks and stuff. It's going to sound stupid, but it's true, and I'm speaking from actual experience. The best word I can come up with is claustrophobia.
Yeah.
I have a hard time finding a face mask that I can breathe through. It doesn't like start freaking me out and this kind of stuff. So a lot of times, I'm sitting there doing stuff, I probably should be wearing a face mask when I'm mowing the yard. I don't do it. We used some kind of epoxy paint to paint the floor on the gym in our church a while back, and I had a face mask and it was only part way on my face. I had part of it scooching out a little bit because I had to breathe, and the job had to get done, but I couldn't. I just can't breathe through the things. Now, granted, I haven't ever broken out one of these $50, $60, $80 serious respirator things, but
Well, they're even harder to breathe through.
yeah, and I just can't do it. But I'm hard-headed enough. The job needs to be done, but I can't breathe through the stuff. And so I'm like, I try to, keep my breathing shallow and that kind of stuff. And like when we paint the gym, I'm in there for a few minutes, then I'm out the door for a few minutes, getting fresh air and going back in, so I'm not getting too high. But if I can't use a mask, I can't use a mask. And if I can't get the job done, I can't get the job done.
Yeah.
So that's me.
And, I'm going to cite Tom's cited a personal example. I'm going to cite another one. And it wasn't a pesticide that created the issue with me, but it was excuse me, I can't.
Was it a horse?
No, I can't. You got your hand in front of your mouth. I can't hear. But I have, on more than one occasion, worked with a forklift, and it's a propane type lift in an enclosed cold storage, and the propane lift is supposed to be free of fumes, carbon monoxide, so you don't have issues with that. But we weren't real diligent with our management of the air filters and so forth. So the air filter was clogged. And after about an hour, hour and a half of working in the cooler with that forklift, I realized that I could not navigate the upright. I was trying to stack bins, and to be honest, I was drunk enough I couldn't get them to go where I wanted to go. And I had been in there with that forklift running long enough that I had gained a concentration of carbon monoxide into my blood system. And that was, you couldn't smell it, there was no indication that it was there. But that almost put my lights out. I managed to get out of the cooler and went to the house for an hour, hour and a half. I realized what was going on with it. And as that began to subside a little bit, I sort of sobered up, so to speak. But I had the most horrendous headache that anybody has ever imagined. And Advil or Tylenol or anything wouldn't touch it. But I stayed at the house for a couple of hours and kind of came out from under it. And I thought, well, I wasn't finished with what I was doing. I needed to go back. Went back in the cooler, and it wasn't 10 minutes. I was just like I had been before. The carbon monoxide had gotten in my blood system, and it made it really rough. So, sometimes you may be exposed to things, and the same thing is true with pesticides. You may not be aware that you're getting that type of exposure, but the information that Dr. Weaver provided there should be things that make you more aware of potential problems. And it can occur from I don't know whether you noticed the toxicity of salt is a lot greater than a whole lot of the herbicides and pesticides that we use. Nicotine was one of the most toxic things that was listed on that chart. And there's a lot of folks that we deal with every day that are attempting to poison themselves with smoking cigarettes or dealing with smokeless tobacco. So, and I know that the South Side economy is based on tobacco production, but that's just an example of some of the potential toxicities. So, all right, any questions? Ms. Carroll, you've been mighty quiet today. Hadn't had an opportunity to say a thing.
I'm good.
You're good? Okay. All right. No questions, anybody? Tyler, another chance. No. Rachel, your turn.
I'm good.
All right. Well, that's what I had intended to do today, was expose you to that. Sorry, but it's an issue trying to get these buttons manipulated correctly. I've got 6 on one panel and 9 on another, and I've got to put them in a proper sequence to get them to work. And I haven't figured out exactly how to do it yet, but we managed to get it done. So
Yes,
thank
it's
you,
all
guys.
Carolyn's fault.
No.
What was that, Tom?
I said it was all Carolyn's fault.
Was it? Well, we'll take off 3 points off her grade today for that.
Aw.
Only 3. You're such a softie.
Well, second offense is 6, so we'll be all right.
Uh-huh.
What?
That's fine.
Yes.
Be careful. We'll see you next week.
Again, you're in trouble.
That's all.
What's that? I'm just picking on you. Your turn to barrel a while ago.
Okay, so we done?